In October of 1777, 7,000 of the finest soldiers in the British Empire marched into the forests of upstate New York. Within 10 days, every one of them who survived had laid down his weapons in surrender. And the moment it all collapsed came not at dawn, not in the clean light of a set-piece battle, but in the last gray minutes of a single autumn evening, when a wounded American general drove his horse through a gap in a log wall and an entire empire's northern army ceased to exist. Think about that. 7,000 men, a complete field army of one of the most powerful militaries on earth, equipped, trained, disciplined, led by professionals who had won wars on 3 continents. Gone, not bled white over a season of campaigning, broken in a single twilight hour against a fortification made of stacked pine logs, defended by exhausted men who could barely see the enemy coming through the smoke and the dark. Battles are not won by numbers. They are won by the moment numbers stop mattering. And on the evening of October 7th, 1777, on a wooded crest above the Hudson River, the numbers stopped mattering. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a hastily built earthwork that should never have fallen became the hinge on which an entire war turned. You'll understand why the strongest fort on the battlefield was the one that doomed the army, and why the weakest one was the one nobody thought to protect. You'll see the 400-yard gap that no one closed, the disgraced general who had no right to be on the field and won the battle anyway, and the single musket ball, fired in the dark by a soldier whose name we will never know, that shattered a leg and, in doing so, may have changed how an entire nation would remember one of its greatest fighters. We will trace the 3-week starvation that broke a proud army before a shot was even fired. We will follow the reconnaissance that became a massacre, the death of the one commander holding the British line together, and the chain of collapse that ran from an open wheat field to 2 reinforced cabins to the flawed redoubt on the extreme right flank. And we will end at a monument that stands today in a quiet field in New York, a marble carving of a single boot, honoring the man who won the decisive battle of the American Revolution, a monument that, by deliberate design, does not bear his name. This is not a story about a glorious charge. It is a story about decisions, about the slow accumulation of small errors that become one enormous catastrophe, about terrain and timing, and the terrible mathematics of a flank left undefended. This is the Battle of Bemis Heights, and this is the night that doomed Burgoyne's army. Before we step into the smoke, we have to understand how 7,000 men ended up trapped in a forest with no way out. To understand why the autumn of 1777 mattered so much, you have to understand what the British were trying to do, and how completely it had already failed before the climactic battle was even fought. The British grand strategy for 1777 was, on paper, a thing of elegant ambition. The rebellion in the American colonies was strongest in New England, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in the towns where the first shots had been fired, and where the spirit of resistance burned hottest. British planners reasoned that if they could physically sever New England from the rest of the colonies, they could isolate the heart of the rebellion and crush it at leisure. The instrument of that severing would be geography itself. A great corridor of water ran through the wilderness of northern New York. Lake Champlain in the north, draining down toward the Hudson River, which ran south all the way to New York City. Control that corridor, and you drew a line across the continent that the rebellion could not cross. Albany, sitting on the upper Hudson, was the keystone. Take Albany, hold the river, and New England would be a severed limb left to wither. The plan called for 3 forces to converge on Albany like the closing of a fist. From the north, descending out of Canada down the Champlain-Hudson corridor, would come the main army under Lieutenant General John Burgoyne. Gentleman Johnny, to his troops, a man of theatrical confidence, a playwright as well as a soldier, who had personally championed this campaign in the drawing rooms of London. From the west, advancing through the Mohawk Valley, would come a secondary force under Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger. And from the south, pushing up the Hudson from New York City, would come the main British Army under General Sir William Howe. 3 prongs, 1 target, a converging strangulation of the rebellion's beating heart. It was the kind of plan that looks unstoppable on a map in a warm room far from the actual forest. And by late September of 1777, it had already fallen completely apart. The first failure came from the south, and it was the most consequential. General Howe, who was supposed to drive north up the Hudson and meet Burgoyne at Albany, instead made an independent decision that would help destroy the entire campaign. He sailed south, toward the Chesapeake, to capture the rebel capital of Philadelphia. It was a glittering prize, and Howe took it. But in doing so, he removed the southern prong of the strategy entirely. He left behind in New York City only a skeleton garrison under Major General Sir Henry Clinton, a force far too small to fight its way up the Hudson in time to relieve anyone. The fist that was supposed to close on Albany now had only one finger driving north, and that finger had no support behind it. The second failure came from the west. St. Ledger's expedition through the Mohawk Valley ran into a savage ambush at the Battle of Oriskany, and then bogged down in a failed siege of Fort Stanwix. His Native American allies, seeing the campaign stall and their losses mount, began to melt away into the forest. Without them, his regulars had no choice but to turn around and retreat all the way back to Canada. The western prong was gone too, which left Burgoyne alone. And here is where Burgoyne made the decision that sealed his fate. Having crossed the Hudson River with his army, confident, advancing, certain that Albany lay within his grasp, he made a choice that every cautious commander in history would have shuddered at. He deliberately severed his own lines of communication back to Canada. He cut the cord. The reasoning was that he could move faster and forage off the rich New York countryside, living off the land as he drove toward his objective. It was a gambler's logic, the logic of a man who believed he would win quickly enough that supply lines wouldn't matter. The instant he cut that cord, Burgoyne's army of roughly 7,000 men, British regulars, German mercenary auxiliaries from the small states of Central Europe, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, became an island of red and blue uniforms adrift deep inside hostile territory, with no reinforcement coming, no supply arriving, and no easy way back. Opposing him was the American Northern Department, and it was growing by the day. Its commander was Major General Horatio Gates, an officer whose entire temperament was the opposite of Burgoyne's. Where Burgoyne was theatrical and aggressive, Gates was cautious, defensive, an entrencher by instinct, a man who liked to make the enemy come to him across ground of his own choosing. And Gates had chosen his ground brilliantly. He had positioned his army atop Bemis Heights, a natural choke point of high ground overlooking the Hudson River, a place where the road and the river funneled together beneath commanding bluffs. As word spread through the countryside that the British were coming, and as stories of plunder and the killing of civilians spread with them, the local militias mobilized in their thousands. Gates's army was swelling toward 12,000 men. The numbers were tilting, and they were tilting hard. The two armies first collided on September 19th at a clearing called Freeman's Farm. It was a brutal, grinding, tactical stalemate. Hours of close-range volleys in and around the tree line, terrible casualties on both sides, and no decisive result. The British technically held the field at the end of the day, but they paid a price in dead and wounded they could not afford and could not replace. The Americans pulled back to their entrenchments, bloodied but intact, their numbers already beginning to regrow as the British numbers shrank toward nothing. After Freeman's Farm, the two armies settled into a tense, 3-week pause. Burgoyne entrenched and waited, pinning his last hopes on a relief force from Clinton coming up from the south, a force that, as we have seen, was far too small and far too slow to ever arrive in time. The Americans waited too, growing stronger, watching, tightening the noose. It was out of this stalemate, this slow strangulation in the cold autumn forest, that the climactic battle would erupt. But to understand why the British broke so completely when they finally broke, you have to understand what those 3 weeks of waiting did to them. Because before the Americans ever fired the shot that doomed Burgoyne's army, hunger and cold had already done half the work. War is often imagined as the clash of arms, the volley, the charge, the bayonet. But far more often, war is decided by bread, by boots, by the simple question of whether an army can eat. And in the 3 weeks between September 19th and October 7th, the British army in the forest above the Hudson slowly, agonizingly, began to starve. Burgoyne's predicament was a trap with no good exit. He could not advance. The American positions on Bemis Heights were too strong, too well entrenched, too well defended. To throw his diminishing army against them in a frontal assault would be to invite annihilation. But he could not retreat either, not safely. To withdraw north would mean abandoning his artillery and his baggage train, the heavy guns and supplies that represented both his fighting power and his dignity as a professional commander. To leave them behind would be a humiliation. And so the army did neither. It sat. It dug in. It waited. And it was, in the cold language of the strategist, effectively paralyzed. Into that paralysis poured the consequences of Burgoyne's earlier gamble. He had cut his own supply lines, betting on foraging off the land. But the Americans had a ruthless answer to that bet, and it was one of the oldest and most effective tools of war: scorched earth. American militias under officers like Brigadier General Abraham ten Broek and General Fellows ranged out across the countryside around the trapped British army, and they systematically stripped it bare. They drove away the cattle so there would be no meat. They burned the standing crops so there would be no grain. They felled trees across the roads so there would be no movement. They dismantled the bridges so there would be no crossing. Everything that an army needs to survive and to move, food, fodder, passage, they took away or destroyed. Every British foraging party that ventured out came back with less than the last. The land that Burgoyne had counted on to feed his men had been turned, deliberately and methodically, into a wasteland. The effects were swift and corrosive. The army went on short rations, then shorter. The draft animals, the horses and oxen that pulled the precious artillery and the supply wagons, began to starve, growing weak, dying in their traces. And every horse that died was a gun that could no longer be moved, a wagon that could no longer follow, a small, permanent reduction in the army's ability to either fight or flee. Slowly, animal by animal, the British Army was losing the physical means of its own mobility. And then the weather turned, as it always does in upstate New York in October. Freezing rains came. Temperatures dropped. Men who were already hungry were now also cold and wet, huddling in entrenchments that turned to mud, their uniforms never drying, their morale draining away, night after miserable night. Consider what this does to a soldier over 3 weeks. Hunger erodes strength. A man on short rations cannot march as far or fight as hard. Cold and wet erode health. Sickness spreads through a damp, crowded camp faster than any enemy. And the slow accumulation of misery erodes the one thing that matters most of all in a soldier: the belief that he is part of a winning army. The men in that camp had crossed the Hudson as conquerors, confident, advancing. 3 weeks later, they were trapped, hungry, freezing, and increasingly certain that no relief was coming. Combat effectiveness is not just a function of numbers and weapons. It is a function of whether a man has eaten, whether he has slept, and above all, whether he believes he can win. By early October, the British answer to every one of those questions was sliding toward no. The army that would march out to fight on October 7th was not the army that had crossed the river. It was a hollowed-out shadow of it, and the men in the American camp above them knew it. But here is one of the great ironies of the Saratoga campaign. While the British camp was being slowly destroyed by logistics, the American camp was being torn apart by something else entirely. Not hunger, not cold. The American crisis was a crisis of command, a poisonous, escalating feud between two men whose mutual hatred would, in one of history's stranger turns, end up producing the very aggression that won the battle. The American army on Bemis Heights had a problem at its very top, and the problem had two names: Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold. Gates, the commander, was a political general. He was cautious, careful, defensively minded, and acutely conscious of his own reputation and standing. He was the kind of officer who fought battles in part to be seen winning them, who understood that glory reported to Congress could matter as much as glory earned in the field. And he had under his command a subordinate who was, in almost every respect, his temperamental opposite. Major General Benedict Arnold was a fighter. Fiery, aggressive, impulsive, physically fearless to the point of recklessness. Arnold was the kind of tactician who saw the decisive point of a battle and hurled himself at it. At Freeman's Farm on September 19th, it had been Arnold's immediate, instinctive battlefield interventions that had done as much as anything to halt the British advance. He had a genius for the chaos of combat, an almost uncanny spatial awareness, and a charisma that made men follow him into fire. He was, by the testimony of those who fought beside him, one of the most naturally gifted battlefield commanders the Continental Army possessed. And Gates could not stand him. The break came over the report of Freeman's Farm. When Gates wrote his official account of that battle to the Continental Congress, he made a deliberate and pointed omission. He left out any mention of Arnold's contributions entirely. The man whose aggression had blunted the British attack was simply erased from the record, as though he had never been there. For an 18th century officer, a man for whom honor and reputation were not abstractions, but the very substance of his standing in the world. This was a wound that cut to the bone, and it landed on a man already raw. Arnold had reasons to feel slighted that ran back months. The previous February, Congress had passed him over for a promotion, elevating other officers above him despite George Washington's direct and personal recommendation that Arnold be advanced. To Arnold, who measured himself by his battlefield record and found it unmatched, this was an unforgivable insult, proof that the politicians valued connections over courage. Now Gates had compounded the injury by stealing the credit for September 19th. The confrontation, when it came, was volcanic. The two generals had a furious, shouting argument in the American headquarters. The kind of screaming match that leaves a command structure permanently fractured. And in its aftermath, Gates struck. He relieved Arnold of his command. he brought in Major General Benjamin Lincoln, an officer who technically outranked Arnold, and made him second in command and commander of the right wing, the very position from which Arnold had fought. Arnold was left with nothing. No troops, no portfolio, no place in the chain of command. He was, in effect, ordered to sit in his tent and watch. Arnold, predictably, threatened to leave the army entirely. He would resign, he would go elsewhere, he would not endure this humiliation. And he very nearly did. What kept him on Bemis Heights was not Gates, but his fellow officers, men who knew exactly how valuable Arnold was in a fight, who had seen him work on September 19th and who signed a formal petition begging him to stay. Out of respect for them, and perhaps out of an inability to tear himself away from the battle he could feel coming, Arnold remained. So consider the situation as the morning of October 7th approached. The most aggressive and tactically brilliant general in the American army was present on the field, but had no command, no authority, and no official place in the order of battle. He was a loaded weapon, with no one holding the trigger. He was confined, sidelined, furious, and watching. And he was about to ignore every bureaucratic reality that confined him in the most spectacular way imaginable. Hold that image in your mind. The caged general. We will come back to him. Before the battle, we have to walk the ground because at Bemis Heights, more than at almost any other battle of the Revolution, the terrain and the fortifications were the battle. The outcome was written into the architecture before the first shot was fired. To understand how the British line broke, you have to understand how it was built. After the bloodletting at Freeman's Farm, British engineers had set about fortifying their camp. The line they constructed ran from the Hudson River westward, across a series of wooded ravines and open clearings, anchoring the Army's position against the American forces above them. The critical problem was the right flank, the western end of the line. The American left dominated the high ground to the south, which meant the British right was the vulnerable shoulder, the place most likely to be turned. And so it was there, on the western extremity, that the British poured their engineering effort, constructing two primary outworks supplemented by a web of smaller positions. The differences between those two main fortifications would dictate everything that followed. The first and stronger of the two was the Breymann Redoubt, sitting on the Freeman Farm. It was named for Alexander Lindsay, the 6th Earl of Balcarres, who commanded the British light infantry, and it was a monster of a fortification. It stretched roughly 500 yards in length and rose 12 to 14 feet high, a massive traditional timber and earth wall built to absorb punishment. In front of it lay an abattis, a dense, vicious barrier of felled trees with their sharpened branches pointing outward toward any attacker, an obstacle specifically designed to break up advancing infantry formations and hold them helpless under fire while the defenders raked them. The Breymann Redoubt was engineered to shrug off frontal artillery bombardment and massed musket fire alike. Against a straightforward infantry assault from the front, it was, for all practical purposes, impregnable. Anyone who tried to storm it head-on would die in the abattis. Roughly 400 to 500 yards to the northwest, on the extreme right flank of the entire British line, sat the second fortification, and it was a very different animal. This was the Breymann Redoubt, named for its commander, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Christoph von Breymann of the Brunswick Grenadiers. And where the Breymann Redoubt was a fortress, the Breymann Redoubt was a compromise. A hastily constructed, structurally flawed work that betrayed every sign of having been built in a hurry by men who never expected it to bear the full weight of an assault. It extended some 200 to 300 yards along a slight north-south crest. But its construction was the opposite of the Balcarres' work. Instead of massive earthen walls, the Breymann Redoubt was built of rail-like logs, stacked horizontally between vertical upright posts, standing only about 7 to 8 feet tall. And here is the fatal detail, the single architectural fact that would matter most. There was no packed earth banked against the outside of those log walls. None. The Balcarres' Redoubt had earth to absorb the kinetic energy of cannonballs and musket fire. The Breymann Redoubt had only bare wood. That made it dangerously vulnerable both to artillery and to physical breaching by infantry. Thin pine logs splinter. They do not stop a determined charge the way an earthen rampart does. The redoubt held 2 German 6-pounder cannons, protected by a pair of embrasures on its right side, and near the center of its rear wall was a sally port, a narrow passage that allowed defenders to slip out for counterattacks, protected on the inside only by a small earthen traverse. That sally port, that little doorway in the back of the fort, will matter enormously before this story is done. The terrain in front of the Breymann Redoubt shaped how it could be attacked. American officers who were there, men like Colonel Rufus Putnam and Major Henry Dearborn, confirmed that the ground immediately to the west of the redoubt was a cleared, open field, stretching roughly 120 to 250 yards before it hit dense timber. What that meant tactically was simple and brutal. Any force attacking the Breymann Redoubt from the west would have to break cover from the tree line and cross open ground, fully exposed to the muskets and cannon of the German defenders before they could reach the walls. It was a killing field by design, on paper. And then there was the space in between. Between the mighty Balcarres Redoubt and the weaker Breymann Redoubt lay a gap, a sprawling 400-yard interval in the British line. And that gap was anchored by almost nothing. Just 2 small, pre-existing log cabins, reinforced and garrisoned by 2 companies of loyalist Canadian militia. These structures, history remembers them as the Canadian cabins, were supposed to knit the line together, to provide interlocking fields of fire that would protect the interior of the British camp and keep the 2 redoubts mutually supporting. But look at what they actually were. 2 small cabins, 2 companies of militia, not regulars, not the disciplined professionals of the line, but local loyalist auxiliaries, holding 400 yards of front. And on the far side of that gap, on the extreme flank, sat the Breymann Redoubt with its thin log walls and its open sally port. The entire integrity of the British right depended on those 2 cabins holding. If the cabins fell, the left flank and the unprotected open rear of the Breymann Redoubt would be laid bare. The strongest fort on the field, the Balcarres Redoubt, would be untouched and irrelevant, because the army would be unraveling around it. The British had built a fortress and a compromise and connected them with a thread. And the Americans were about to find the thread. Before the storm breaks, we should know who was standing on each side of that thin log wall, because the contrast between them is the contrast that decided the battle. The defenders of the Breymann Redoubt were, at their core, soldiers of the Duchy of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, German troops, often loosely and inaccurately called Hessians by the Americans, though Breymann's men came from Brunswick specifically. Lieutenant Colonel von Breymann commanded the Grenadier Battalion that bore his name, an elite converged unit assembled from grenadier companies drawn out of several Brunswick musketeer regiments. The Prince Friedrich, the von Retz, the von Specht, and the von Riedisel. Grenadiers were chosen men, traditionally the tallest, strongest soldiers in each regiment, the shock troops, the elite, and they looked the part. The Brunswick Grenadiers were visually striking, rigidly disciplined, and trained in the precise linear tactics of the European battlefield. They wore deep blue coats with distinctive regimental facings, and on their heads they still wore the antiquated Prussian-style grenadier mitre caps, tall, conical headgear crowned with polished brass front plates that caught the light and made each man seem to tower. They were supplemented by a detachment of Jaegers, elite German light infantry, riflemen clad in green, the specialists in skirmishing and sharpshooting. But here's the thing about the defenders of the Breymann Redoubt on the afternoon of October 7th. There weren't enough of them. A significant portion of the garrison had been siphoned off earlier in the day to take part in the great reconnaissance force that Burgoyne had pushed out, which meant that when the crisis came, the redoubt was held by only about 200 men. 200 Brunswick Grenadiers, Jaegers, and Loyalists, to defend 300 yards of flawed log wall. The elite were spread thin to the point of breaking, and their commander, Breymann, was a man of iron. He was famous for his harsh, unbending discipline, an officer wholly at home in the rigid order of European warfare, where men stood shoulder to shoulder in straight lines and obeyed instantly. That rigidity was a strength on the open plains of Europe. It was about to become a fatal weakness in the chaos, the smoke, and the darkness of an American forest, where the neat lines dissolved into a brutal, individual knife fight kind of war that Breymann's training had never prepared him for. Across the field, the American assault force was something Breymann's men had likely never imagined. A lethal blend of two completely different kinds of soldier fused into a single weapon. The first element was Morgan's riflemen, commanded by Colonel Daniel Morgan, a corps of frontier sharpshooters from Virginia and Pennsylvania, armed with the American long rifle. The long rifle was a marvel of accuracy, capable of striking a man at ranges exceeding 200 yards, far beyond the reach of any smoothbore musket. But it had two crippling weaknesses. It fired a tight-fitting patched ball that took far longer to load than a musket, and, critically, it could not mount a bayonet. A rifleman who fired and missed, or who was caught reloading, had nothing in his hands but a long club. Against a bayonet charge, riflemen were desperately vulnerable. Which is why the second element existed: Dearborn's light infantry, commanded by Major Henry Dearborn. A battalion of Continental light infantry armed with standard smoothbore muskets, each one fitted with a bayonet, a steel blade 14 to 18 inches long. Dearborn's men were the shield to Morgan's sword. When the riflemen had fired their slow, devastating volleys, they could fall back behind Dearborn's hedge of bayonets to reload in safety, while the bayonets held off any British rush. Accuracy and shock married together. It was a combination the rigid Europeans had no easy answer for. Behind these specialists came the mass. The Continental Brigades under Brigadier General Enoch Poor and Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned, New England regulars, the heavy infantry needed to actually assault and hold fortifications. These were not the militia of popular imagination, the farmers who grabbed a musket and went home after a fight. By 1777, the Continental Line had been drilled and hardened into something approaching a professional army, men who could stand in formation, deliver disciplined volleys, and press home an assault against fortified positions. Learned's brigade included the 8th Massachusetts Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks, an aggressive unit that would play a decisive flanking role before the day was out. And behind them came raw numbers. The massive brigade of New York militia under Brigadier General Abraham Ten Broek, thousands of men whose sheer weight would prove instrumental in cracking the British line. The militia might not have the staying power of the Continentals in a prolonged stand-up fight, but thrown against two cabins held by two companies, their numbers were a hammer. What made the American force genuinely dangerous was not any single one of these elements, but the way they were meant to work together. The riflemen killed at range and stripped away officers. The light infantry's bayonets protected the riflemen and provided shock. The Continental Brigades provided the disciplined mass to assault works and hold ground. The militia provided overwhelming numbers at the decisive point. On paper, it was a beautifully balanced instrument. In practice, on a chaotic battlefield in failing light, it would take a commander willing to ignore his orders and ride through crossfire to make all those pieces strike the same point at the same moment. That commander was waiting, furious, in a tent he had been forbidden to leave. Accuracy, shock, mass, and numbers against rigid discipline spread too thin behind a flawed wall. That was the equation. Now the day begins. By the first week of October, Burgoyne's choices had narrowed to almost nothing. He could break the American lines and reach Albany, or he could begin a humiliating retreat back toward Fort Ticonderoga. There was no third option, and the first one was a long shot. But Burgoyne was a gambler, and he had one piece of news that gave him a sliver of hope. Intelligence had reached him that Sir Henry Clinton, far to the south, had finally captured 2 American forts in the Hudson Highlands on October 6th. Help, perhaps, was stirring. If Burgoyne could find a weakness, hold on, force the issue, perhaps the campaign could yet be saved. And so, on the morning of October 7th, he ordered a reconnaissance in force. The idea was to push a strong detachment out toward the American left, probe for a soft spot, perhaps draw off American troops, and gather the information he needed to decide whether to attack or retreat. But reconnaissance in force is a phrase that hides a danger. To reconnoiter, you send scouts. To reconnoiter in force, you send an army. And an army, once committed and exposed, can be brought to battle whether it wants to be or not. At roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a British detachment of 1,500 men, nearly a third of Burgoyne's entire effective strength, marched about 3/4 of a mile out of the fortifications and deployed into a formal line of battle in a clearing known as Barber's Wheat Field. At their head rode Brigadier General Simon Fraser, by general agreement Burgoyne's most capable, most aggressive, and most beloved field commander. Fraser arranged his force in the textbook manner. British grenadiers under Major John Dyke Ackland on the left flank, German regulars holding the center, and the light infantry under Lord Balcarres on the right. Up on Bemis Heights, Gates received word of the British advance. True to his nature, he would have preferred to stay behind his entrenchments and let the British dash themselves against his works. But 1,500 British soldiers standing in a wheat field was an opportunity too rich to ignore, and his officers pressed him. Grudgingly, Gates released his attack. He sent Morgan's riflemen and Dearborn's light infantry against the British right, Poor's brigade against the British left, and Learned's brigade to strike the German center. The Americans came down off the heights and into the wheat field, and the combat that followed was immediate, close range, and devastating. On the British left, Major Ackland saw the Americans coming and made an aggressive choice. He ordered his grenadiers to launch a preemptive bayonet charge to hit the Americans before they could organize. But before the grenadiers could close the distance, Poor's New Hampshire Continentals halted and unleashed a single massive, concentrated volley straight into the British ranks. The effect was catastrophic. Ackland himself was shot through both legs and went down, instantly incapacitated. With their commander fallen and their charge shattered before it began, the grenadier line crumbled. Poor's men surged forward into the wreckage, took Ackland prisoner where he lay, and captured the British artillery on that flank. The British left was collapsing within minutes. On the British right, The American killing machine of rifles and bayonets went to work. Morgan's sharpshooters picked apart the British light infantry from a distance, dropping officers and men, while Dearborn's bayonets covered them and kept the British from closing. Lord Balcarres' men were steadily pushed back into the woods, their formation buckling. With both flanks bending and breaking, the entire British reconnaissance force teetered on the edge of a complete and disorganized rout. And in that moment of crisis, one man held the British Army together by sheer force of will: Simon Fraser. There are moments in battle when the survival of an entire force comes to rest on the presence of a single human being, and the wheat field on October 7th was one of them. As his flanks crumbled, Simon Fraser mounted his conspicuous gray horse and rode into the chaos to do the one thing that might save his men: be seen. He rode back and forth through the crossfire, rallying the faltering light infantry, steadying the line, covering the developing withdrawal with his own visible, fearless presence. As long as Fraser sat that gray horse and moved among them, the British regulars held their discipline. He was the spine of the force. Everyone on that field, on both sides, could see it, including, from a distance, a man who was supposed to be confined to camp. Benedict Arnold, stripped of his command, ordered to his tent, watching the battle unfold with the agony of a fighter forced to stand idle. Recognized exactly what Fraser was doing and exactly how dangerous it was. According to the accounts that have come down to us, Arnold rode up to Colonel Morgan, pointed across the field at the officer on the gray horse, and told him plainly that the man was worth a regiment to the enemy, that he was a host unto himself, and that he had to be brought down. Morgan understood. He gathered his best marksmen and gave them their target. What followed has become one of the most famous shots in American history, even though we do not know who fired it. A sharpshooter took aim from the tree line at a range of nearly 300 yards, an almost impossible distance, at the extreme edge of what even a long rifle could do. The first shots came close. Fraser's saddle, his horse's crupper. The rounds were finding his range. And then a ball tore through Fraser's midsection, knocked him from his gray horse, and mortally wounded him. For generations, folklore has given the credit for that shot to a specific man: Timothy Murphy, an Irish-American frontier rifleman of legendary skill. But honesty compels us to acknowledge what the historians who have actually examined the contemporary evidence find: that the primary sources from 1777 simply do not name the shooter. One account speaks only of an old man with a long hunting gun. The name Timothy Murphy attached itself to the legend in the 19th century, long after the fact. We celebrate a specific marksman, but the truth is that the man who fired the most important shot of the battle, perhaps of the campaign, is anonymous. History remembers the bullet. It forgot the finger that pulled the trigger. But the bullet was enough. The tactical effect of Fraser's fall was immediate and total. With both flanks already breaking, and now, the one commander holding everything together carried bleeding from the field. The British reconnaissance force suffered a complete psychological collapse. The spine snapped. Burgoyne, seeing the disaster, ordered a general retreat and rode back toward the entrenchments to organize a defense. And the remnants of his 1,500-man detachment, the third of his army he had risked on this probe, fled in terror back across the ground they had advanced over, streaming toward the only safety they could see: the great walls of the Balcarres Redoubt and the log line of the Breymann Redoubt. The reconnaissance had failed utterly. It had not found a weakness in the American line. It had revealed a fatal weakness in the British one. It had not drawn off American strength. It had thrown away a third of Burgoyne's fighting power and killed the best general he had. and it had set in motion a pursuit that would not stop at the wheat field, or at the redoubt walls, or anywhere short of the destruction of the entire army. Because the Americans were coming. And one of them, against every order, was about to take command of the whole thing. Up in the American camp, Benedict Arnold could no longer bear it. The roar of musketry and artillery rolling up from the wheat field, the unmistakable sound of a British army breaking. And here he sat, a major general with no command, reportedly pacing his tent like a caged animal, listening to the greatest opportunity of the war unfold without him. There is a point past which a man of Arnold's nature simply cannot be contained by a piece of paper or an order from a rival he despised. Arnold reached that point, and he shattered it. He mounted his horse, a dark mount that history and legend have given the name Warren, said to honor Major General Joseph Warren, the martyr of Bunker Hill who had given Arnold his first commission. And he spurred it violently toward the sound of the guns. He had no authority to do this. He held no command. He was, in the strictest bureaucratic sense, a private citizen on a horse galloping into a battle. Gates, realizing what was happening, immediately dispatched an aide, Major Armstrong, with orders to bring Arnold back to headquarters. But Armstrong had no chance. You do not catch a man like Benedict Arnold once he is riding toward a fight he means to win. The aide chased him across the chaos of the battlefield and never laid a hand on him. Arnold rode into the heart of the pursuit, where the American forces, having broken the British in the wheat field, were now slamming into the formidable defenses of the Balcarres Redoubt. General Poor's New Hampshire Continentals had run straight into the jagged abattis, fronting that 12-foot earthen wall, and the British, now reinforced by the survivors fleeing back from the wheat field and supported by grape shot from their heavy guns, were pouring a withering, sustained fire down into the American ranks. Men were dying in the felled trees, tangled in the sharpened branches, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat. Into this maelstrom galloped Arnold. One Continental officer who watched him said he behaved more like a madman than a cool and discreet officer. Wielding no official command but radiating an authority that men simply obeyed, Arnold tried to force the issue, urging Poor's men forward, trying to drive an assault home through the abattis and over the walls of the Balcarres Redoubt by sheer ferocity. But ferocity was not enough. The Balcarres Redoubt was exactly what it had been built to be, impervious to a frontal assault. The earthen walls were too thick, the abattis too dense, the defensive fire too heavy. The American attack stalled violently and bloodily, men cut down in heaps before the impenetrable logs and earth. A lesser commander, or a more stubborn one, might have kept hurling men at that wall until the brigade bled out. Arnold did something else. In the middle of the chaos, with bullets and grape tearing the air around him, he read the battlefield, and he saw the answer. This is the moment that reveals why Arnold, for all his recklessness and all his later infamy, was a genuine tactical genius. Surrounded by the noise and smoke of a stalled, failing assault, he lifted his eyes from the wall in front of him and took in the larger geometry of the whole battlefield. And he understood, in an instant, where the British were going to break. He saw that Learned's brigade and Morgan's forces were shifting northward, toward the far right of the British line. And crucially, Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks of the 8th of Massachusetts had been scouting that flank and had recognized something vital. The Breymann Redoubt, out on the extreme right, looked desperately vulnerable from its left and its rear. The strong fort, the Balcarres Redoubt, was a trap that would swallow any frontal attack. But the strong fort was not the key to the line. The key was the weak link that connected it to everything else. That weak link was the 400-yard gap, held only by the 2 Canadian cabins and their 2 companies of Loyalist militia. Arnold saw it whole. The Breymann Redoubt could not be taken from the front, so don't take it from the front. Take the gap, punch through the thread holding the line together, and the impregnable fort becomes irrelevant. The flank of the weak redoubt becomes exposed, and the entire British right comes apart from the inside. He acted instantly. Arnold wheeled his horse and did something that should have killed him. He rode recklessly along the front, directly between the firing lines of the 2 armies, through the crossfire of British and American muskets, and emerged somehow untouched on the other side. It was the kind of ride that builds legends, and it put him exactly where he needed to be. In a position to take de facto command of elements of Learned's brigade and 10 Browick's freshly arrived New York militia. No one questioned him. In the chaos of battle, a general who knows exactly what he wants and rides through fire to demand it does not get asked for his paperwork. Arnold pointed them at the gap and turned them loose. 10 Browick's militia and Learned's right-hand regiments crashed down on the Canadian cabins with overwhelming numerical force. A tidal wave of Continental and militia infantry against 2 small companies of Loyalist provincials. The Canadians fired briefly, did what they could, and then faced the simple arithmetic of their position. A handful of men against a flood. Their position became untenable in moments. They broke and fled toward the eastern woods, abandoning the cabins, abandoning the gap, abandoning the thread that held the British right together. The capture of the Canadian cabins was the fatal structural failure in Burgoyne's entire defensive design. The 400-yard gap was now controlled by the Americans, and far more importantly, the fall of the cabins completely unhinged the Breymann Redoubt. Stripped of the flanking protection the cabins had provided, the left side and the open rear of Breymann's position, including that narrow, fateful sally port, were suddenly laid utterly bare to the American infantry now pouring through the gap. The strongest fort on the field, the Breymann Redoubt, still stood, untaken, defiant, and now completely beside the point. The battle had flowed around it. The decisive ground was 400 yards to the northwest, at a thin wall of pine logs defended by 200 exhausted men who did not yet know that their flank and their rear had just been thrown open to the enemy. And the sun was going down. Now the light begins to fail, and the failing light becomes a weapon. The date was October 7th, and in the Saratoga region, the sun set shortly after 5:19 in the evening. The fighting at the Breymann Redoubt happened in the deepening twilight, in that brief and terrible window when day surrenders to night. Visibility collapsed. The battlefield became a confusing, shifting tableau of shadow and movement, lit only in sudden, strobing flashes by the muzzle blasts of muskets and the bloom of cannon fire. Each flash printing a frozen instant of chaos on the eye before the darkness swallowed it again. And the smoke, the thick, hanging, sulphurous black powder smoke that no breeze could clear, mixed with the gathering dark until men could barely see the enemy in front of them. This had a profound tactical consequence. The American long rifle, the weapon that had dominated the day from 200 yards and more, was now almost useless. You cannot snipe what you cannot see. Long-range accuracy was entirely negated by the darkness and the smoke. And so the final assault on the Breymann Redoubt would not be decided by the rifle at all. It would be decided by the oldest and most brutal tools of the infantryman: the bayonet, the clubbed musket, the body, the will. It would be a close-quarters fight in the dark. And close-quarters fighting in the dark favors shock, surprise, and aggression over discipline and order. It favored, in other words, exactly the kind of war the Americans had become, and exactly the kind of war Breymann's rigid grenadiers were worst equipped to fight. Inside the redoubt, Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich von Breymann found himself in an impossible position, though he may not yet have fully grasped how impossible. He commanded perhaps 200 exhausted Brunswick grenadiers and Jaegers, defending 300 yards of unreinforced log breastwork. And descending on him in the fading light was a coordinated pincer he could not see and did not expect. From the west, breaking out of the tree line and across that cleared 120-yard field, the killing ground that was supposed to slaughter any attacker, came Daniel Morgan's riflemen and Henry Dearborn's light infantry, hurling themselves straight at the timber walls in a raging frontal assault. And simultaneously, pouring through the newly opened gap where the Canadian cabins had stood, came Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks at the head of the 8th Massachusetts, with elements of Learned's brigade sweeping in a hook around the redoubt's left flank and into its exposed rear. The Brunswickers fought. They poured point-blank musket fire and double-shotted canister, clusters of iron balls that turned each cannon into a giant shotgun, from their 2 6-pounders into the surging American lines. Men fell. But the killing field did not do its work, because the Americans crossed it too fast, in the dark, in a rush that gave the defenders only moments to fire before the attackers were at the walls. And the thin pine logs that made up those walls now revealed their fatal flaw. With no earth backing them, they splintered under return fire, offering the Germans little real protection. Dearborn's men reached the front parapet and went over it with the bayonet. Brooks's men surged over the breastworks on the flank and rear. The redoubt was being breached from 2 directions at once, and the 200 defenders simply did not have the bodies to hold every threatened point at the same time. And then, into the rear of the fort, through the sally port itself, came Benedict Arnold. Having engineered the collapse of the gap, having found the thread and pulled it, Arnold rode to deliver the killing stroke himself. Leading a party of riflemen, he identified the central sally port at the rear of the Breymann Redoubt, the narrow passage protected only by its small earthen traverse, the back door that the fall of the Canadian cabins had left exposed. With his sword drawn, Arnold breached the traverse and drove his horse, Warren, directly through the sally port and into the interior of the German fortification, into the heart of the enemy position, demanding the immediate surrender of the stunned Brunswickers around him. Imagine it from inside the redoubt. The darkness, the smoke, the flash and roar of muskets from the front wall. The Americans coming over the parapet to the west with bayonets. The 8th Massachusetts pouring in from the flank and rear, a direction that was supposed to be protected and was now wide open. And then a mounted American general bursting through your own back gate, sword raised, screaming for your surrender. The psychological shock of a multi-directional bayonet attack in the dark, with the enemy suddenly inside the fortification, was more than even elite. Disciplined troops could absorb. The Brunswickers broke. The discipline that had defined them, the rigid order that was the source of all their strength, shattered all at once. Dozens of them threw down their weapons. Others, in a blind panic to escape, tried to vault over the rear log walls into the eastern woods, and some of them, in the dark, fell onto their own bodies or onto the bayonets of the converging Americans, killed by the very defenses meant to protect them. The elite grenadiers of Brunswick, the chosen men in their tall brass-fronted caps, were coming apart in the smoke. And in the center of that disintegration stood their commander. And what Breymann did next is one of the most chilling images the battle produced. Heinrich von Breymann, the officer of iron discipline, the man who had built his entire identity on order and obedience. watched his elite grenadiers flee before colonial militia in the dark. And he broke. Not physically, psychologically. Driven by every account to a kind of murderous rage at the sight of his men running, he refused to surrender, drew his saber, and began hacking at his own retreating soldiers, trying to stop the rout through sheer terror, through the draconian violence that European discipline reserved for cowards. He cut down his own men. He severely wounded or killed 4 of them with his own blade, slashing at the panicking Brunswickers in a furious, doomed attempt to drive them back to a wall that could no longer be held. His men had a simpler solution. One of the Brunswickers, desperate to escape both the Americans flooding in and the deranged commander cutting at him from behind, leveled his musket at Breymann and shot him dead. With Breymann dead in the dirt of his own redoubt, killed by one of his own soldiers, whatever organized resistance remained inside the position evaporated instantly. The Breymann Redoubt had fallen. The extreme right flank of Burgoyne's army was in American hands, and the road into the unprotected rear of the entire British camp lay open. It was, in every sense that mattered, the end for Burgoyne's army. But it was not quite the end of the fighting in the redoubt, because in the chaotic final seconds, as the Americans flooded in and the victory was sealed, the battle reached out and struck down the man who had won it. In the last moments of the assault, with the redoubt all but taken, a final volley tore out of the darkness. Or perhaps it was a single parting shot from one of the retreating German soldiers, a last act of defiance from a man fleeing into the woods. We will never know precisely who fired it, and that anonymity, given what the shot accomplished, is one of the cruelest details of the entire battle. The heavy German musket ball found its mark twice over. It struck Arnold's horse, Warren, directly in the heart, killing the animal instantly. And another heavy lead ball found Arnold himself. In a twist of ballistic fate that borders on the unbearable, the ball tore into Arnold's left leg, the exact same leg that had been shattered by a ricochet 2 years earlier during his desperate, freezing assault on the walls of Quebec on the last night of 1775. The same leg, wounded again at the climax of his greatest victory. To understand what that musket ball did, you have to understand the physics of 18th century ammunition. The ball was cast from soft, solid lead, large in caliber and low in velocity by modern standards. When it struck bone, it did not pass cleanly through. It flattened, it deformed, it dumped its entire enormous kinetic energy into the leg in an instant. The ball shattered both bones of the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, just above the left ankle, tearing through muscle and tissue and blood vessels, and leaving behind a horrific compound fracture. The bone broken and driven out through the flesh. And then the dying horse fell, and the cruelty compounded itself. As Warren collapsed, the animal rolled, and its enormous weight came down on Arnold's uninjured right leg, pinning it beneath hundreds of pounds of dead horse and trapping him in the dirt. So there lay the general who had just won the decisive battle of the American Revolution. One leg shattered and bleeding freely into the ground, the other leg crushed and pinned beneath his dead mount, helpless, writhing in agony in the twilight, while his triumphant soldiers secured the fortification around him. It was here, in that moment of victory and ruin, gazing at the captured redoubt he had given everything to take, that Arnold is said to have spoken the words that history remembers. When a soldier asked where he was hit, Arnold answered that the ball had struck his leg, and then added that he wished it had struck his heart instead. It is easy to read that as the cry of a man in unbearable pain, and it was surely that. But there was something deeper in it, something Arnold himself seems to have grasped with terrible foresight, even as he lay bleeding. A man who dies on the parapet at the moment of his greatest triumph becomes a martyr. Immortal, fixed forever in the pantheon of heroes. A man who merely lives, who limps away into the long, uncertain years that follow, is left to face whatever those years may bring. Arnold, in that instant, may have sensed that surviving this wound would cost him more than dying from it ever could. Major Henry Dearborn was among the first officers to reach him in the dark. Dearborn was a good man to have at such a moment. He had practiced medicine in New Hampshire before the war, and he had marched with Arnold through the frozen hell of the Quebec expedition. The two men had bled in the same campaigns. American soldiers strained to heave the dead horse off their commander's pinned leg. Dearborn went to work on the shattered one, ripping strips of cloth from Arnold's own trousers to fashion a makeshift tourniquet, fighting to staunch the arterial bleeding before it killed him. And at that precise moment, the timing almost too perfect to be real, Major Armstrong finally arrived at the redoubt. Bearing Gates's order for Arnold to return to headquarters, the order to stand down had caught up with him at last. Here, in the captured enemy fortification, after he had already obeyed it in the only way that mattered, through victory and through a wound that would maim him for life. They built a crude litter from a blanket slung between two poles, and under the cover of total darkness, the soldiers lifted their broken general and carried him back through the night toward the American camp on Bemis Heights. Away from the redoubt, away from the body of his horse, away from the high point of his life, toward everything that came after. The wound did not end at the redoubt. In many ways, the wound was only beginning, and what it did to Benedict Arnold over the following months, to his body and to his mind, belongs to this story because the line that runs from this twilight victory to one of the most infamous betrayals in American history runs directly through the agony of his ruined leg. On October 11th, 4 days after the battle, Arnold endured a jarring, agonizing cart ride to a military hospital in Albany. There, he faced the standard 18th century treatment for a compound fracture, the protocol that surgeons reached for almost automatically: amputation. Take the leg off above the break before gangrene sets in, and you might save the man's life. Leave it on, and you might lose both. The surgeons wanted to amputate. Arnold refused, and he refused with the full ferocity of his character. He had spent roughly 7 years before the war, beginning around 1754, apprenticed as an apothecary to his mother's cousins, the Lathrop brothers, in Norwich, Connecticut. He knew something of medicine, enough to argue, enough to be dangerous. He degraded the army surgeons' knowledge to their faces. He threatened them. He declared he would rather die with 2 legs than live with one. Faced with a wounded major general who was both a national hero and entirely willing to make their lives miserable, the surgeons backed down. Instead of amputating, they placed his shattered leg in a fracture box, a rudimentary wooden splint packed with padding to immobilize the limb, and subjected him to the medicine of the age: bloodletting and ointments made from cinchona bark. It went about as badly as it could have gone short of death. By mid-November, the wound had turned grossly purulent, suppurating, infected. And there were no antibiotics. There would be no antibiotics for another century and a half, not for 151 years. Infection in 1777 was something you survived or didn't, largely on the strength of your own constitution. Surgeon James Thatcher was reduced to making deep, unanesthetized incisions into Arnold's leg to drain the necrotic infection, cutting into the living, conscious man to let the corruption out. Arnold endured 5 months of this. 5 months of bedsores and fever and excruciating, unrelenting pain. 5 months flat on his back, helpless, while the leg slowly, grudgingly decided whether to heal or to kill him. It healed, but it healed wrong. When Arnold could finally stand and walk again, his left leg was grossly misshapen and a full 2 inches shorter than his right, leaving him with a severe, permanent limp. He was offered a built-up shoe to compensate for the difference and make walking easier. He refused that too, choosing to carry his agonizing disability as a badge of honor, a visible mark of what he had given at Saratoga. And there, in those 5 months of pain and immobility, the seeds were planted. Because while Arnold lay suffering, 2 things were happening in the world beyond his sickbed, and both of them were poison. First, Horatio Gates, the cautious general who had spent the battle in his tent, who had stripped Arnold of his command, who had tried to order him off the field, was reaping the glory of Saratoga. The surrender of an entire British army was being credited to Gates, the commander of record, while the man who had actually broken the British line lay rotting in a hospital bed. And second, Congress continued to marginalize Arnold politically, to overlook him, to fail to give him the recognition and advancement his record demanded. Pain and bitterness, and the gnawing sense of a debt unpaid and a glory stolen. It was in this period, the long, dark convalescence after his greatest triumph, that the psychological foundations of treason were laid. The man who carried his shattered leg as a badge of honor in 1777 would, by 1780, attempt to sell the fortress of West Point to the British and turn his coat against the cause he had bled for. We will come back to that. For now, hold the image. The hero, broken, embittered, healing crooked, watching another man take his glory. The wound that doomed Burgoyne's army may also have been the wound that doomed Benedict Arnold's soul. But that is a story for the end. First, we have to bury a general and surrender an army. The capture of the Breymann Redoubt did not just win a fight. It rewrote the entire strategic geometry of the battlefield in a single stroke. By taking the redoubt, the Americans had turned Burgoyne's extreme right flank, and they now held a fortified elevation that looked directly down into the exposed rear of the British camp, into the artillery park, the hospital, the supply depot, the soft and vital organs of the army. From that captured crest, the Americans could see everything the British had been trying to protect, and they could attack it at first light. The British made one last attempt to undo the disaster. In the darkness, a disoriented detachment of Germans was sent to retake the lost redoubt. But the night and the confusion that had doomed Breymann's men now doomed their would-be rescuers. An unreliable guide led the detachment straight into the waiting American lines, where they were promptly captured. The redoubt would not be retaken. The flank was gone for good. Burgoyne understood what this meant. He was a gambler, but he was not a fool, and he could read a board as well as anyone. His position was untenable. A morning attack from that captured high ground would tear into the rear of his camp and annihilate his trapped, starving army. There was nothing left to do but run. And so, that night, Burgoyne ordered a silent withdrawal. The British left their campfires burning along the abandoned line as a deception to make the Americans believe the camp was still held. And under the cover of darkness, the army slipped away to the north, falling back to the great redoubt overlooking the river road. The following evening, October 8th, the retreating army paused to honor a final request. And the scene of that pause is one of the most haunting of the entire campaign. Simon Fraser, the beloved general shot from his gray horse in the wheat field, had died of his wound. Before he died, he had asked to be buried at sunset in the great redoubt on the hilltop, with no ceremony beyond the presence of the officers who had served with him. His body had been washed, wrapped in a sheet, and laid out on the dining table in the cabin of the Baroness von Riedesel, the wife of one of the German commanders, a woman whose memoirs would preserve so much of what we know about the human cost of this campaign. She had to hurriedly sweep aside the preparations for her officers' dinner party to make room for the dying and then the dead general on her table. At 6 o'clock in the evening, precisely at sunset, as Fraser had asked, Burgoyne and his staff gathered at the great redoubt for the funeral. The service was conducted with the mournful solemnity of swords and arms reversed, the ancient gestures of military grief. And it was conducted under fire. The American gunners, seeing a cluster of British officers gathered on the hilltop, opened a continuous, harassing artillery bombardment on the gathering, entirely unaware that what they were firing on was not a council of war, but a funeral for a fallen enemy. The dirt kicked up by American cannonballs spattered the mourners as they laid Simon Fraser in the ground. It is a small, terrible image of what war is. Men burying a brave enemy, while other men, not knowing, try to kill them for doing it. After the hasty burial, the remnants of the Royal Army resumed their miserable retreat northward, toward the village of Saratoga, the place we now call Schuylerville. The retreat was a nightmare. Cold rain turned the roads to mud. The starving, exhausted draft animals could barely pull the guns and wagons. American militia harassed the column constantly, sniping, ambushing, never letting the British rest. The retreat that should have been a march became an agonizing crawl, and it did not get far. Surrounded on all sides, completely out of supplies, and outnumbered nearly 3-to-1 by Gates's army, which kept swelling as more and more militia poured in to be present at the kill, Burgoyne came at last to the end of his options. There was no relief coming. Clinton was too far south and too weak. There was no escape north. The way was blocked and the army could not move. There was nothing left. On October 17, 1777, the British Army officially surrendered to Horatio Gates. The numbers tell the scale of the catastrophe. Over the 3 weeks of campaigning that ended at Saratoga, Burgoyne's forces suffered roughly 1,000 casualties in killed and wounded. And then, on October 17th, the survivors laid down their arms en masse. The figure most often cited for the surrender is just under 6,000 men. Some 5,895 British and German soldiers who marched out of their camp with the honors of war and stacked their weapons on the bank of the Hudson, passing into a captivity that, thanks to later disputes over the surrender terms, most of them would never escape. An entire field army of the British Empire erased from the war. Among the dead were General Simon Fraser and Lieutenant Colonel Breymann. Among the wounded and captured was Major Ackland, shot through both legs in the wheat field. American losses on October 7th, by contrast, came to roughly 150 killed and wounded. The most consequential American casualty was not a death at all, but a shattered leg. The wound of Benedict Arnold, the general who had no command and won the battle anyway. It is tempting to see Saratoga as a local affair, an army trapped in a forest, a flank turned in the dark, a surrender in a muddy New York village. But the reverberations of that Twilight Bayonet assault on the Breymann Redoubt did not stay in the forest. They crossed an ocean, and they changed the world. For more than 2 years, the great powers of Europe had watched the American rebellion with interest, but with caution. France, in particular, humiliated by Britain in the previous war, hungry to avenge that defeat and to weaken her great rival, had every reason to want the Americans to win. King Louis XV's court had quietly funneled some aid to the rebels, but it had stopped short of open alliance. And the reason was simple, and it was the reason great powers always hesitate. The French were not convinced the Americans could actually win. To ally openly with a rebellion was to risk war with Britain. No nation takes that risk to back a loser. Before France would commit her treasure, her navy, and her armies, she needed proof. Proof that the Continental Army was not just a band of irregulars who could harass and ambush, but a real military force capable of executing complex, large-scale operations and destroying a professional European army in the field. Saratoga was that proof. The annihilation of an entire British field army, not a skirmish won, not a raid succeeded, but the complete destruction and surrender of 7,000 of Britain's best. Demonstrated to the court at Versailles exactly what they had needed to see. The Americans could win. The Americans could execute multi-brigade offensive operations against entrenched European regulars and prevail. The risk was worth taking. The news of Saratoga reached France and tipped the balance. It directly catalyzed the formal military alliance between the United States and France. An alliance that brought French money, the French Navy, and ultimately French armies into the war on the American side. And that changed everything. A regional colonial rebellion became a global war, one that stretched the British Empire across multiple theaters and oceans and strained it to its breaking point. The road from the Breymann Redoubt led, in time, to the decisive Franco-American victory at Yorktown in 1781, where a British army was again trapped and forced to surrender, this time with a French fleet controlling the sea and French troops in the siege lines. Without Saratoga, there is no French alliance. Without the French alliance, there is very likely no Yorktown. And without Yorktown, the war ends differently, or does not end at all. This is what was decided in the dark on October 7th, by men crossing a cleared field with bayonets and a general riding through a sallyport. Not just the fate of one army, but the entry of France, and through France, the eventual independence of a nation. The thin pine logs of the Breymann Redoubt held up the fate of an empire, and when they splintered, the world shifted. It is worth pausing on the sheer improbability of that chain. A starving army, a feud between two American generals, a reconnaissance that turned into a rout, a marksman shot at 300 yards, a gap held by two cabins, a disgraced general ignoring his orders, link by unlikely link. The chain ran from a wooded crest in New York to a throne room in Versailles to the founding of a republic. That is how history so often turns, not on grand inevitabilities, but on a cascade of small contingencies that only looks inevitable once it is over. Step back from the smoke for a moment and look at what actually decided this battle. Because the lessons of Bemis Heights are not lessons of courage alone. They are lessons of structure, of geometry, of the way small flaws become total catastrophes. The first lesson is that the strongest point is not always the decisive point. The Balcarres Redoubt was the mightiest fortification on the field. 12 feet of earth and timber, fronted by a savage abattis, manned by light infantry and heavy guns, impervious to frontal assault. And it mattered almost not at all. Arnold's men broke themselves against it and accomplished nothing. The battle was decided 400 yards away at the weaker fort and the gap beside it. Strength that cannot be brought to bear at the decisive point is wasted strength. The British poured their engineering genius into a wall that the battle simply flowed around. A defense is only as strong as its weakest link, and the British weakest link, 2 cabins and 2 companies of militia holding 400 yards, was where the whole thing came undone. The second lesson is the danger of the unguarded flank and the open rear. The Breymann Redoubt was vulnerable, not because its defenders lacked courage. The Brunswick Grenadiers were elite troops who fought hard, but because of structural facts that had nothing to do with valor. The walls had no earthen backing. The garrison had been stripped to 200 men. The flank depended entirely on the Canadian cabins, and the rear had an open sally port. Each of these was a manageable risk on its own. Together, and once the cabins fell, they became a death sentence. A fortification that can be entered from the rear is not a fortification. It is a trap for its own defenders. Breymann's men died, in large part, because someone else's position, the cabins, gave way, exposing them to an attack from a direction they had every right to believe was safe. The third lesson is the supremacy of combined arms and adaptability over rigid doctrine. The Americans won this fight by fusing things that should not have fit together. The long-range precision of Morgan's rifles, the close-quarters shock of Dearborn's bayonets, the mass of the Continental Brigades, the numbers of the militia. Each element covered the weakness of another. Rifles that could not take a bayonet were shielded by men who carried nothing else. And crucially, when the rifle was rendered useless by darkness and smoke, the Americans simply shifted to the bayonet and kept coming. They adapted to the conditions of the night. Breymann's Grenadiers, by contrast, were prisoners of their own discipline. Trained for the ordered linear battlefield of Europe, they had no good answer for a chaotic, multi-directional night assault. Their greatest strength, rigid order, became their fatal weakness the moment the battle stopped being orderly. When Breymann's response to chaos was to hack at his own men, he was not being uniquely cruel. He was being uniquely, tragically rigid, trying to impose European order on an American nightmare and dying for it. The fourth lesson is the decisive power of aggressive command at the critical moment. Strip away the legend and the later treason, and look only at what Benedict Arnold did on the afternoon and evening of October 7th. He read a battlefield he had no authority over. He recognized that the frontal assault on the Breymann Redoubt was futile and disengaged from it. He saw the gap that no one else was exploiting. He rode through crossfire to seize control of troops not under his command and hurled them at the one point where the British line would break. And he was there, physically, at the sally port, at the climax, driving the attack home. This is what command looks like at the sharp end. Not the careful management of a battle from a tent, but the instant recognition of a decisive opportunity and the ruthless will to seize it before it closes. Gates won the surrender. Arnold won the battle. The difference between those two things is the difference between a commander of record and a commander in fact. And the fifth lesson, the quiet one underneath all the others, is that armies are destroyed long before they surrender. By October 7th, Burgoyne's army was already beaten. It had been beaten by the cut supply line, by the scorched earth, by 3 weeks of starvation and freezing rain, by the slow draining of morale and strength and hope. The battle did not create the British defeat. It merely revealed it, gave it form, brought it to its inevitable conclusion. The reconnaissance that became a massacre, the flank that was turned, the redoubt that fell. These were the visible collapse of a structure that hunger and isolation had already hollowed out from within. Logistics is not the boring part of war that happens before the fighting. Logistics is the part of war that decides who is still standing when the fighting comes. Battles end, but the men who fight them go on, into fates as varied and strange as the battle itself. Let us account for them, because Bemis Heights scattered its participants across the whole range of human destiny, glory, obscurity, death, and one of history's most famous betrayals. Simon Fraser, the general on the gray horse, lies where he asked to lie, buried at sunset on the hilltop under American fire. the most honored of all the casualties of the day. His death in the wheat field was the first domino, the moment the British reconnaissance lost its spine. He was, by the testimony of friend and enemy alike, the best field commander Burgoyne had, and his loss was one the army could not absorb. He is remembered. The anonymous marksman who killed him is not, and the legend that filled that void with the name of Timothy Murphy is a reminder of how history, hungry for a hero, will invent one when the records stay silent. Heinrich von Breymann lies in an unmarked grave somewhere near the redoubt that bears his name, killed by one of his own soldiers in the chaos of the night. There is a grim justice in it that contemporaries did not miss. An officer whose harsh discipline had made him hated by his own men met his end at the hands of one of them, shot down while cutting at the soldiers he commanded. He died defending an indefensible position, betrayed by the structural flaws of the fort and the collapse of the cabins beside it, and then by the very men whose obedience he had tried to compel through terror. His name survives on the redoubt and in the history books. His reputation does not survive intact. Major John Dyke Ackland, shot through both legs in the wheat field and taken prisoner, has one of the gentler fates. His wife, Lady Harriet Ackland, undertook a remarkable journey through the lines to nurse him in American captivity, one of the genuine human bright spots of a brutal campaign. He survived his wounds and was eventually exchanged. Horatio Gates, the cautious general who spent the battle in his tent, reaped the immediate harvest of Saratoga. The surrender of Burgoyne's army made him, for a time, the most celebrated soldier in America, the hero of Saratoga. And there was even talk of replacing Washington with him. But Gates's glory did not last. His later command in the Southern Theater ended in catastrophe at the Battle of Camden in 1780, where his army was routed and Gates himself reportedly fled the field for many miles, a humiliation from which his reputation never recovered. The man who took the credit for Saratoga is remembered today as much for running from Camden as for anything he did on Bemis Heights. The American officers who did the fighting went on to varied ends. Daniel Morgan, whose riflemen anchored the day, would go on to win one of the most brilliant tactical victories of the entire war at Cowpens in 1781, cementing his place as one of the finest combat commanders America produced. Henry Dearborn, the medically trained light infantry major who fashioned the tourniquet for Arnold's shattered leg, had a long and distinguished public career ahead of him, eventually serving as Secretary of War. John Brooks, whose 8th Massachusetts executed the decisive flanking hook into the Breymann Redoubt, would one day become governor of Massachusetts. The men who climbed those splintering log walls in the dark scattered into the life of the new nation they had helped to create. And then there is Benedict Arnold. His fate is the one everyone knows, and it is the reason this entire story carries a weight that few battles do. The man who won the decisive battle of the American Revolution, who broke the British line, who turned the flank, who rode through the sally port and gave his leg to the cause, did not become a martyr or a celebrated hero. He became the most infamous traitor in American history. The seeds we watched being planted in that hospital bed in Albany grew exactly as we feared. The bitterness over Gates stealing the glory of Saratoga, the fury at being passed over and marginalized by Congress, the chronic pain of the crooked, shortened leg that would never let him forget what he had given and how little he felt he had received in return. Mounting debts, a sense of grievance that curdled over the years into something poisonous, and a conviction that the cause he had bled for had failed to honor him. In 1780, Benedict Arnold, by then in command of the vital American fortress of West Point on the Hudson, conspired to surrender that fortress to the British for money and a commission in the British Army. The plot was discovered almost by accident when his British contact, Major John Andre, was captured with the incriminating documents. Arnold escaped to the British lines. He spent the rest of his life in exile, despised by the country he had betrayed and never fully trusted by the one he had defected to. Dying in London in 1801, his name transformed into a synonym for treachery. It is one of the cruelest arcs in American history, and it loops directly back to that twilight at the Breymann Redoubt, to the wish he muttered as he lay pinned beneath his dying horse, that the ball had struck his heart instead of his leg. He understood, even then, what survival would cost him. Had he died in the moment of victory, he would be carved in marble in every town square in America, the fallen hero of Saratoga, beyond reproach forever. Instead, he lived, and the living man made choices that erased the hero and left only the traitor. Which brings us at last to the strangest monument in American military history. Today, the ground where the Breymann Redoubt stood is part of the Saratoga National Historical Park, a quiet landscape of fields and woods in upstate New York, where, if you did not know what had happened there, you would see nothing but pleasant, rural country. There are no trenches now. The log walls rotted away centuries ago. The killing field is just a field. But along the southern path of the former redoubt stands one of the most unique and melancholy memorials ever raised on a battlefield. It is called the Boot Monument. Erected in 1887 by John Watts de Peyster, a New York militia general and Saratoga historian, it takes the form of a white marble shaft topped by the barrel of a cannon, and draped over that muzzle, carved in relief, is a single object. A left military boot, crowned with the two-star epaulette of a major general and wreathed in laurel, the laurel of victory. The inscription honors the most brilliant soldier of the Continental Army, the man who was desperately wounded on this spot, at the sally port of Burgoyne's Great Western Redoubt on the 7th of October, 1777, winning, in the monument's own words, the decisive battle of the American Revolution for his countrymen, and the rank of Major General for himself. The monument does not bear his name. It is, by deliberate design, anonymous, and by the reckoning of those who study such things, the only war memorial in the United States dedicated to a specific person that does not carry that person's name. It honors the left leg of Benedict Arnold, the leg shattered in the Twilight assault, the leg he refused to let the surgeons take, the leg that healed crooked and short and made him limp for the rest of his life. And it honors the brilliant soldier he was on that single evening, while refusing to speak the name of the traitor he became. It is a monument to a wound, to an act of valor, to a moment of genius, carefully severed from the man who performed it. America could not bring itself to honor Benedict Arnold. It could not bring itself to forget what he did at Saratoga either. So it built a monument to his boot and left his name to the dark. There is no better symbol for the whole tangled story of the night the British Army died. The strongest fort that did not matter, the flank that was left open, the general who had no command and won the battle, the marksman whose name we lost, the commander shot down by his own men, the hero who became a traitor, and in the end, a marble boot in a quiet field, honoring everything and naming nothing. We began with 7,000 men marching into a forest, certain of victory, severing their own lifeline behind them. We end with a single carved boot, a wreath of laurel, and a deliberate, eloquent silence where a name should be. In between lay one autumn evening, a wall of pine logs, and the moment that numbers stopped mattering, when an outnumbered, ill-supplied army of farmers and frontiersmen and newly minted regulars turned the flank of an empire in the dark and changed the course of the world. The British were stronger. The British were better supplied, better trained, better equipped, more experienced. The British had built the mightier fort, and none of it saved them, because they left a gap of 400 yards held by 2 cabins and a redoubt with an open back door, and they trusted that the strength of their strong points would cover the weakness of their weak ones. It did not. It never does. The boot still stands in the field at Saratoga. The army it doomed has been dust for 2.5 centuries. And the lesson waits there in the marble, nameless and patient, for anyone willing to learn it. That battles are not decided where you are strongest, but where you are weakest. And that the impossible, when it comes, almost always comes in through the door you forgot to guard.